Hey gang, it's Ryan from Old School Automotive here, and today we're doing a little bit of a different project. Well, maybe not that different. It's bodywork, sheet metal, that type of stuff, but we're kind of trying to un-eff someone else's bad workmanship here. Let me show you what we're working with real quick. So this is today's project truck. It's an old body style Ford F350. It was a cabin chassis truck. And because the cabin chassis had different wheelbases, this thing has got a longer than normal wheelbase in the rear. It originally would have been, just a bare frame. Previously, this thing had a flatbed on it, but the current owner wanted a regular pickup box. So he had a great idea. He took one dually pickup box, cut the front off it, and was going to take a couple extra feet of another pickup box and weld it to the removed front of the dually pickup box. The problem is the guy that said he was a welder and was going to do the work wasn't. And he royally effed this thing up, and now it's up to us to un-eff this thing. You can see, first of all, this person has never heard of a straight edge. Whoever did this, if you're watching and you know who you are, you need to step away from the Sawzall, man, and put the beers down, because this is absolutely horrible and unacceptable. There's no reason that this was done like this other than sheer laziness and incompetence. No reason whatsoever for it to have been like this. And then the welds along the side of the body are horrendous. Like, I don't know what they were thinking here, but this weld action is terrible. And I guess they planned to fill these gaps. Like, he just put in metal and was just lap welding stuff in. And dude, if you're gonna cut and splice a body together, do it someplace besides where the fuel door is. Come on, this isn't hard. So if the person who did this would have taken maybe 5 minutes and just laid down a piece of masking tape to cut along, it would have made this job so much easier. As it is, just because of sheer laziness, they're making this job 100 times harder than it had to be. And over here, it looks like they were, I don't know if they were using a MIG welder or a stick or what, but they, instead of tacking it like you're supposed to do and keep the heat out of the panel, can you see how badly this panel is warped? I sure hope that's showing up. This is absolutely ridiculous. There is no need of this. So what we're gonna have to do to un-eff this completely terrible workmanship is we're gonna have to take about I measured the furthest point warped or cut out this way to the furthest point cut out this way is about 4.5 inches. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a straight line across here and across here 5 inches apart, and we're going to cut out 5 inches, and then we're going to go to the spare bed that this original front section was cut off of, and we're going to cut a 5-inch section out of it, and then we're going to weld it in. And then for the outside, this is pretty awful. We're probably going to have to cut this out entirely, and there's a piece, and again, they cut out a piece of patch section, but it's like, dude, if you're going to cut out a piece of patch section, why not cut a straight line? I don't understand people. There are people, this is a perfect example of someone who will work harder at doing it the wrong way than just simply doing it the right way. I don't understand this. There's a right, I'm all about doing stuff sloppy, folks, but when doing sloppy makes the job harder, there's no point. You might as well do it the right way if the right way is easier. So anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox now and go back inside the garage and show you how we're getting that straight 5-inch section out of the bed. Here we're inside with the replacement bed that we're going to cut our patch section out of. And what I did is I just ran a tape measure from the back edge of the bed to the front edge and found about the shortest point. And the shortest point for me was about 68 inches. So what I did is I made a couple of marks with my soapstone, 68 inches here, 68 in the middle, 68 on this side. And being this is corrugated, if you're going to do this with just tape or something, make a mark on every single one of these corrugations. Since I happen to have a laser level, I just ran my carpenter's laser level, and I'm having it project a laser along here. And I used my soapstone and just drew a little line right along the laser. Next up, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take a piece of 2-inch wide masking tape and just lay it right along this soapstone line, so I've got a nice hard crisp edge to cut along. Then all I simply have to do is measure 5 inches back, lay another line, lay another piece of tape, cut along that, and I'll have a perfectly square 5-inch section to patch that piece of crap that's out in the yard. Then when I get the patch section, I just take that out to the other truck, lay it across the other area, and just use it as a template to cut the bed and weld the new piece in. Again, it's making me do double, triple, probably 4 or 5 times the work than if they'd just done it right the first time. If you don't know what you're doing, folks, if you don't know what you're doing and you're working on a project for somebody, just tell them, hey man, I don't know what I'm doing. Don't screw it up so the next guy like me has to un-eff your problems, because it would have been way better for them to just bring me 2 beds and I could have just cut them straight to begin with. But instead now I have to do twice as much. I have to not only undo the work that was done, but then I have to redo it the right way. So I'm doing the work to undo your mess up. I'm then redoing it the right way, and I have to add in a whole extra weld that's gonna be double the welding for me, and for the body guy that has to clean up those welds and do the body work on it, he's gonna have to do double the body work. So just by you being lazy, you screwed up 2 other people's lives. Well, not their lives, but just the job that they're gonna do in this truck. If you're gonna do crappy work, just don't do it. I'm all about doing something sloppy, but only if it works. So just take that to heart. All right. After laying down masking tape as our straight line guide, we're gonna follow up with a zip disc and cut as straight as we possibly can. All right, as you see, we've now got our straight line cut across, and I was just thinking while I was cutting this, you know, I did use a laser to get my marks in place, but really the tape is what it all boils down to. The thing you got to be careful with the tape is as you're laying it across these peaks and valleys, it's real easy for it to start moving different directions. So if you're going to use just tape, make sure you have a reference measurement on each peak and each valley to make sure that the tape is laying and continues in a straight line. But again, you can, like I said, as long as you just use your tape measure and you're careful with your tape application, there's no reason why you need a fancy laser level. I just happen to have one laying around. But at any rate, now we've got a straight line like the first guy should have had to begin with. Now we're just going to measure, 5 inches back, and we're going to draw another line, and we're going to cut it out, and then we'll have our patch section ready to go. Just like our last cut, we're going to measure, lay down a straight line, and cut with the zip disc as straight as possible. Okay, so we're up in the bed now, and we got our crazy, crooked, stupid gap here. So I took a measurement. You see up in the front edge of the bed here, where the bed sheet metal ends. I hooked the tape on here, and same thing over here. And I marked out, in this case it was 28 inches back. And then I just moved my piece of sheet metal back and forth until it met an even measurement on both sides. So then we know that it's square. Let me friggin' get this in here square. Come on. Here we go. And there we go. Okay. So once this is all lined up, I'm just going to clamp it down. In fact, I might even use, I got some Cleco fasteners I might just use to hold this together. And then what I'll do is I'll just use the piece of sheet metal as a straight edge and then cut along it. And then once it's all cut along, I can just tack weld it in place. And then we'll rinse and repeat for the other side. Okay, so next up, we've got all the edges cleaned of paint with the grinding wheel. Same for where it's going to weld in. Now I haven't cut this back edge yet, so what we're going to do is this. This is going to lay in here. Here, let me get some magnets on here so I can hold this in place. Alright. So, what we're going to do is we're going to lay this in here. And I'm going to go around and put some tack welds on this edge here until this is all nicely in place. Now this back edge I haven't cut yet. Once the tack welds are made, then I'm going to come along here with a zip disc and just use the edge of it as my guide, and then I'll have a perfect amount of gap for welding it in. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy once you get that first set of tacks made. So I'm going to go ahead and set up the camera on a time lapse here, and we're going to go ahead and start tacking this baby in. As you start to fit the panel into place, it's helpful to have some magnets or some of those sheet metal clamps, something to hold the sheet metal in place so that you can concentrate on tacking the sheet metal without having to worry about it moving around. once you've got one side tacked into place, the other side is going to overlap slightly. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the zip disc to go back and basically use the patch piece as the straight edge for cutting. And then I'm going along and tacking little by little, and something to be aware of is as the tack welds cool, it's going to pull that metal together, so that gap that you cut with the zip disc might contract a little bit. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm opening up that gap again so I can get the right amount of penetration for this butt weld. Once we've got that, we're just going to go slowly, tacking it into place, work it with the hammer and the dolly. You can use a pick or a screwdriver to manipulate that metal and get it so it lines up and is a straight line. You can see here I'm using the screwdriver to kind of bend that metal so everything lines up right. Then just continue tacking until it's all stitched together. Okay, now we're going to deal with this butchered bedside, and just this is absolutely unacceptable. I mean, we got these welds are just pulling apart here. Looks like they used what they should have done. See, they got a piece of the other bed that they cut out and they backed it up to try to do a lap weld. What they should have done, instead of wasting this piece of metal, they should have just laid it over top, cut it with the zip disc like we talked about, and then just butt welded it in place, because I mean, it doesn't even line up. Like, they didn't even attempt to make this stuff line up at all. I mean, look at this gap. You can't fill that with body filler. And I think the other problem is that whoever was welding this, just judging by the weld beads, if they did this with a MIG, they have no idea what they're doing. But I think more likely, it looks like they were using one of those cheap Harbor Freight stick welders, like one of those 110 volt stick welders. This is just, I mean, my welds are awful, but this is just ridiculous. Here we go. I mean, let's see if we can get that to focus. That's a perfect weld if I've ever seen one. So what we're going to do, we're going to have to cut all this out first, because, and they didn't even make a straight line here again. And we're right close to this stake pocket, so I don't want to cut this back too far to get a straight line, because I don't want to intrude into that stake pocket. But I need to make this a straight line so I've got something to weld on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out all these little welds and remove this piece of patch panel, and maybe it's salvageable. I don't know. We'll see. Otherwise, we've got the other chunk of the original bed that I hopefully can salvage enough pieces to make this work. And then I'm going to cut this weld out of here, and then I can just reline up this body panel, because this is just atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. Whoever did this, you should be ashamed of yourself. All right, let's get to work. All right, here I'm just using the zip disc to cut out all the poorly done lap weld patch panel, and then I'm going over the weld and looking for any places that need to be cut out and redone entirely. Okay, so we got the old weld cut out, and I'm pretty sure they didn't even get this thing straight. It looked like it had a pretty good downward cant to it. So what's next is, I think I'm going to take some angle iron and lay some angle iron across the top of these bedsides and clamp it so it'll at least be level, and then do another piece of metal or angle iron along the inside and clamp it together so it'll hold the bedsides together the way they need to be for lining up there. And then I think we'll just put some tacks in here to hold this and then deal with the rest of this body line. The other thing that I noticed while I was cutting out these welds, and this is the piece of backer that they were using, it's actually part of the bed. Would have been a great patch panel if they hadn't trashed it all and warped the hell out of it. But what I'm noticing is I believe there is ever so slight of a taper in this body line, that it gets, this body line is mostly level, and I think this one slightly tapers up as it comes in. So the measurement from the top body line to the bottom body line on these two panels is slightly different. So what I think we're going to end up doing, it's going to have to be, dealt with by the body man who eventually, uses Bondo to smooth this out. I'm going to do my best to make his job as easy as possible, but what I think we're going to have to do is we might actually use a piece of this panel, and it'll be a two-piece patch. We'll have to put in one piece patch in the bottom and probably go halfway up the fuel door, and then we'll have another piece that we'll cut out of the spare bed that will come down from the top and go the rest of the way. Or maybe even just from the body line down, because up to here, I think that body is going to come together enough that we can use the existing sheet metal. So if I can avoid putting another welded section in, I'll do that. So maybe we'll just above the body line, we can have like a 90-degree and come down. We'll see what we can do here. Let me do a little brainstorming and come back. Okay, so here you can see that I used a piece of angle iron on the top, clamped to the bedside to get the vertical alignment of the bedside. So what you can't see is there's a piece of square tubing around the back side of that bed that's being clamped to hold it side to side area while I tack this back together. Okay, gang, so out of the other spare bed, even though they even hacked out patch panels, like thinking they were going to patch stuff. I don't know what they were thinking, but they just hacked it all up. I was able to just barely salvage enough metal out of that bed to get a 3-inch wide panel here. So what I've done is I've laid a vertical piece of tape here, and I'm going to lay in my patch panel. And it looks like I didn't have that tape quite vertical, so I'm going to have to go back, do a little adjustment here. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clamp this patch panel to the rear piece of the bed, and then use the patch panel as my cutting guide and just cut along it. And then I've got this piece, because the bed sides are meeting up here, I went 1 inch above the body line and cut off, and I'm able to get a patch panel here. And these just barely are enough to meet in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a nice square cut on the back body here, and then I'm going to zip disc. Well, I'm going to get basically a straight vertical line, or at least a line that matches up with this edge, and then I'll lay it in, zip disc along the back edge, tack it into place, rinse and repeat for the top part. And also, because the other idiot cut off at an angle, this isn't even a square part right here. It kind of goes at an angle. So what I'm going to end up doing, this is all the metal I could salvage. So the front edge I'm going to leave extra thick, and I'll just cut with a zip disc, so my weld is going to come down and then make a slight bend. I mean, it's not ideal, but that's what I got to do with the little scraps I got left. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the time lapse and show you how I do that. So when you're stitching in a patch panel like this that hasn't been cut out yet, generally you can lay that patch panel in place and run the zip disc along the edges. That will give the width of the zip disc as your gap between the two metals, which is generally the right amount for getting good penetration on a butt weld. Once I've got it, where I like it, I'm going to add some tack welds until this is held properly. Now I've got some clamps along the bottom with another piece of angle iron to hold those bed sides in alignment while I do the rest of my cutting and tacking. Again, I'm going to run around the edge of it with the zip disc. It's going to give me the right amount of gap in order to weld this patch panel in properly. Now I'm moving on to the top section. Same thing, rinse and repeat. I mark my lines using the existing patch panel that I'm going to be welding in, cutting it out, and then tacking it in, being careful to go really slow, working the metal very carefully so that everything lines up and so that I'm not warping the sheet metal, using lots of compressed air, going real slow, only 1 or 2 quick tacks at a time. At this point it's becoming pretty apparent that there's quite a belly to the right-hand side sheet metal panel. You can see how there's like a crown where it's rising up, and that's what that horizontal line is. I actually took the zip disc and I cut a horizontal line in there to remove a little bit of material so I can pull that belly of the metal back in, and then just tacking it into place. That's a way of shrinking metal. That's how Chad Hiltz from Bad Chad on Discovery does his, and it works here. Just a little bit of hammer and dolly work to dress that weld, and I'm going to go back and just fill in any place that needs filling. Okay, so here's where we stand right now. We've got our lower patch panel tacked in place. The upper patch panel is also tacked in place. Now, you might be wondering why I cut into what was otherwise a perfectly good panel. Well, remember I was talking about how there was some taper to the body lines on this? Okay, what was going on was that there was a little bit of this panel needed to be shrunk because just the amount of metal here and the amount of metal there were different. And so it ended up where this was kind of flat and this was bowing way out kind of toward the camera there. And so the panel needed to be shrunk. So I'm a follower of Chad Hiltz on YouTube there, and how he shrinks metal in a situation like this is he just takes his little zip disc and cuts a little line, and you're just able to push the panel in to where it needs to be, you know, tack it along here. And then by the time I'd pushed this in and tacked it, this zip cut was already pressing up against itself. So I ran the zip cut down it again another time, and then just got it all into place, and then just laid some little tacks along it. And you'll notice when you get down and look at it, see it's pretty well straight. This has actually got a little bit of more bow to it. This is kind of like what this other panel was doing, but this was bowed out so far. If their body and fender guy wants to try to shrink this down, he can go ahead and do that, but it's going to be pretty straight as is, so much so that they should be able to fill this in with some body filler. And well, my tack welds are kind of in the way here. Let me see if I can find a spot with, there we go. Now I'm not straddling any tack welds, so we're talking pretty good panel. So due to the camera cutting out, we just jumped ahead to the end. We filled in all the tack welds, filled in the entire weld, and did it slow enough that we didn't warp the panel. Okay, sorry gang, my camera storage got filled up there and I didn't realize it, so a lot of this I kind of jumped to the end. But you can see the finished product here. This is not my best work by any stretch of the imagination. You can see there is some warping. A lot of it is due to the fact that when the previous guy tried to weld this together, the panels were already horribly warped. But what really kind of is a better testament to how this works is this cut along here. Because remember I was saying how because of the taper of this panel that this section was shorter than this section, and I had to bring them together by cutting this horizontal cut here, kind of like Chad Hiltz from Bad Chad Customs does. Just by cutting it and removing material, I was able to push in the sheet metal and kind of basically shorten it up in this dimension. And this, by welding it nice and slow, you can see there's a little bit of puckering going on there, but it's not too bad. This over here, there was two welds that were close together. It was already warped. I had to do some hammer and dolly action. I'm probably going to do some more hammer and dolly action on this to smooth it out because it's kind of ugly. And I didn't like the way the torch shrinking method that I attempted on here worked out. That's what a lot of like this distortion is from where I tried torch shrinking the metal. It just didn't work out good. So I'm going to come back and hammer and dolly that a little bit more. But basically, I mean, while the techniques didn't pan out as good as I had hoped this time, you kind of see the method that everybody talks about on how to MIG weld sheet metal without warping it. Again, I've never really had super good luck with it myself, but I mean, that's not bad. That's definitely better than it was. And let's go over here to the other side and I'll show you real quick the other side of the bed that I'm working on next. Okay, we're over here on the passenger side, and the previous guy, he ran like heavy, thick, hot bead the whole way down. He didn't space, he didn't backstep, he didn't do any of the stuff you're supposed to do, and it warped this thing so bad. Like the metal was puckered in. It looked almost like it had been pushed in with a roller. It was almost like a ½ inch, almost pushing 5/8 of an inch deep. And with some hammer and dolly work, rather than cut this out and do double welding and possibly double hammer and dolly, I went to town on this with the hammer and dolly yesterday afternoon. And an afternoon's worth of hammering first I used a big piece of heavy square tubing to bridge this gap, and I just beat on it with the backside with a sledgehammer. Because here's the other thing, it's like if I'm already cutting and welding this bed and I had to weld a patch in here anyway, I opened up a big patch because that gives me access to come in behind and actually swing a hammer, and that made all the difference because this went from a ½ inch of pucker inward right here. And with the hammer and the dolly, by working the hammer and dolly right along this seam, anytime you hammer and dolly something, you're compressing the metal, you know, because the hammer is hitting the dolly and it squeezes it. So if you think about this like Play-Doh or like bread dough or something like this, if you were to take bread dough and squeeze it, what's going to happen? It's going to get bigger, right? Well, that's what we're trying to do, because this, if you think of this as being like a single piece of wire that were too short, it would be pulling in the fabric of the surrounding metal. And if you lengthen that wire, it's going to make it, the only way for that length to go anywhere is for it to make a longer arc, and it's basically going to raise up this metal. So by hammer and dollying it right along this weld seam, it is raising up this, it's expanding this metal, and it has to go someplace. In this case, it makes it raise up. And we've gone from a crappy, awful weld down to something that's damn near straight and can just take a skim coat of Bondo. I mean, you can see, maybe you can't, I don't know. Yeah, there's a little bit of shadow there. Like when you get the light just right, you can see. Right down here, I've got it worked out pretty good. That, I'm happy with that right there. This up here, I'm going to work that a little bit more with the hammer and the dolly today, and then we're going to call it good. Using the hammer backed up with the dolly, we're going to go ahead and work this sheet metal until it's as flat as possible. Also, when you're welding thin sheet metal like this, it's a good idea to have some kind of backer in behind. In this case, like I've got just a little piece of aluminum scrap, or if you've got one of those copper spoons that they sell at welding supply stores, you can put that behind the weld, and that way it'll kind of keep that weld puddle from going through and falling in and blowing holes in your sheet metal. Or if you do blow a hole and you got to fill the hole in, using one of these backers is really good. The aluminum and the copper, the weld won't stick to, so it just kind of holds that liquid metal in place long enough to cool, and then you can fill those holes back in real quick. Okay, after lots of welding and grinding and hammer and dolly work, we're about done here. We're just in the final stages, just a few little touch-ups. There were a few pinholes here that I had to fill and grind back down, and then there was a crack here that formed when the sheet metal oil can, because the metal was so thin. They were trying to bridge a wide gap, and once cleaned all the weld bead off, there wasn't anything left. It was just too thin. And then I finished welding the rest of this, and I had to do some hammer and dolly work here. I used the hollow back dolly and the pick to try to shrink this metal down, and then I used the dolly and the flat-faced hammer to try to squish this metal out and stretch this a little bit, try to get the body lines to line up a little bit better. But at any rate, we've got it pretty well cleaned up. I'm just gonna knock the high spots off of the weld, do a little hammer and dolly work to flatten this back out, and then we're going to be about done here. The last step will be to take some self-etching primer, because this is bare metal. The self-etching primer has got like a mild acid that will actually like eat into the metal a little bit to give it a better bite, so that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't come unadhered. I don't know what the right word is for that, but it's a little self-etching primer to stick, and then some primer sealer to protect it from the elements, and then we'll be pretty much done. Send this one down the road. So there you have it. This has been a several-day project to get this custom stretch bed stitched, welded back together, and un-effing some problems that were left over by a previous guy. But all in all, it's coming out pretty good. The owner is going to be pretty happy when he sees this. I'm quite sure it's a significant improvement from what it was, and this will get him where he can use the truck and not lose his tools down through the gaps in the bed until he can get around to having some actual paint and body work done to you know, finish the truck completely. But for now, this will get him working, and I hope you've learned something. When you're welding sheet metal, you want to go slow, you want to tack it, you want to go about 4 tacks at a time. Put lots of compressed air on it to cool it off so you don't warp your sheet metal. If you got thin sheet metal, back it up with a backer like an aluminum or a copper backer. And when you're done, a little hammer and dolly work to get it smoothed out, some self-etching primer, some primer sealer, and that's how you do it. With that kind of basics, you can do all kinds of crazy hot rod stuff. You can section cars, you can chop roofs, you can make 10-foot beds when they were never available from the factory. But anyway, if this video has helped you out at all, liking and subscribing sure helps me out a lot. I'll put a link in the description to some of the tools used so you can get yourself some tools and start doing your own hot rod stuff. Until next time, guys, keep hot rodding, get out in the garage, do some cool stuff, make some things happen, fabricate some things. It's cool. You're going to enjoy it. It's fun. All right, guys, we'll catch you next time here on Old School Automotive. And here we had the finished product. Not going to lose any tools through that gap. And experienced body man can take care of those little bits of warping pretty easily. And we end up with the 10-foot bed for our F350 that was never available from the factory.